right, guys, how's it going?
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. It's last week. Fun, fun, fun. Last week. Well, for most of you, your paper will be due by Wednesday at midnight, so you'll be done with me. Um, Today, we're going to go through existentialism. And I was thinking, what's the best way to introduce you to existentialism? Because it's such a important part of philosophy. And I had written a whole bunch of notes and we were going to go through a whole bunch of theory. But I said, you know what? Existentialism is one of those topics where the people doing the philosophizing are so dynamic and so personally involved that it's very important that you get a sense of who they are. Like existentialism is all about the meaning and value of life, but a lot of that has to do with the identity of the person who is valuing life itself. So existentialism could be considered a branch of axiology in which you figure out, hey, what is the value of life? In ethics, you're looking at what is the value of particular actions or persons. But then in existentialism, you take a step back and say, does life itself have a value? And the only way you can answer that question is just take a step back and say, well, the thing that's living, what is that? Well, it's the human being, right? And then once you figure out what the identity of the truly human is, then you can zero in on what your identity is. Because what you are is going to have a lot to do with what the value of your life is. Who you are is going to determine how valuable your life is. So that's the thing. Who you are says a lot about what kind of value your life is going to have. And that's why I started thinking, wait a minute, these existentialists, these existential philosophers, they live very colorful and interesting lives. So I got to introduce you to them. And so I found some clips on YouTube. We're going to go through 4 or 5 of them and discuss them briefly. That is really going to introduce you to the kind of passion that a lot of these philosophers have, because this passion that they have is not accidental. These people coming up with arguments for the existence of God, or arguments for materialism or dualism or idealism, you don't detect the passion because not much is at stake. But with these philosophers I'm about to tell you now, a lot is at stake. Their understanding of the value of their own lives is at stake. So introducing to these characters is going to be a fundamental part of understanding existentialism and existential philosophy. So here we go. I'm going to go ahead and open up YouTube, and I'm going to share with you all right. So the father of existentialism is usually considered to be a Danish philosopher called Soren Kierkegaard. He's called the father because he's the one who starts a lot of the themes that recur throughout all the existentialist philosophers in the 20th century. So Kierkegaard writes in the 19th century, and then it goes all the way into the 20th century. Some people would go so far as to say that existentialism starts with Pascal, who was the philosopher and mathematician from the 17th century. But we're going to start the story with Kierkegaard. So here we are. Let's see.
Soren Kierkegaard was a brilliant, gloomy, anxiety-ridden, often hilarious Danish 19th century philosopher, the author of 22 books, of which 3 continue to make his name. He was born in an immensely wealthy family in Copenhagen in 1813, the youngest of 7 children. Death was around him constantly from a young age and was to obsess him throughout his career. It is, in a sense, his only theme. Not only was he extremely physically frail, by the time he was 22, all his siblings had died, except for he and a brother. It drove him to furious production of books over 15 years. On a single day in 1843, he published no less than 3 works. He wasn't writing for the money, he was working to save himself and, he thought, humanity. As it happened, he made it to the age of 42, then died of an excruciating spinal disease. In Either Or and Fear and Trembling, what Kierkegaard wants us to do above all is wake up and give up our cozy sentimental illusions. He systematically attacks the pillars of modern life, our faith in family, our trust in work, our attachment to love, and our general sense that life has purpose and meaning. His enemies were the smug in all their guises, particularly the prosperous Danish haute bourgeoisie and the members of the established Danish church. He tells us, "As I grew up, I opened my eyes and saw the real world, and I began to laugh, and I haven't stopped since. I saw that the meaning of life was to get a livelihood, that the goal of life was to be a high court judge, that the brightest joy of love was to marry a well-off girl, that wisdom was what the majority said it was, that passion was to give a speech, that courage was to risk being fined $10, that cordiality was to say you're welcome after a meal, and that the fear of God was to go to communion once a year. That's what I saw, and I laughed." Kierkegaard was especially caustic about the 19th century understanding of love and the new ideology of passionate marriage, which aimed to unite desire with prudence and suggested that one could enjoy all the thrills of a love affair and at the same time all the stability of a long-term relationship. But Kierkegaard mocked the notion that one could ever fuse romantic love with marriage, that one could have passion and sex and at the same time children, stability and routine. He respected both. He just couldn't believe that you could have them both at the same time in a cozy marriage sanctified by the state and the neighbors. His belief arose out of his own tortured love life. He fell in love with a beautiful, precocious and talented 18-year-old girl called Regine Olsen, only then to break off the engagement as he realized that to try and live with her forever would also mean killing the love that had drawn him to her. Everywhere he turned, Kierkegaard saw intolerable incompatibilities and impossible choices. It led him to one memorable explosion in Either Or. Marry and you will regret it. Don't marry, you will also regret it. Marry or don't marry, you will regret it either way. Laugh at the world's foolishness, you will regret it. Weep over it, you'll regret that too. Hang yourself, you'll regret it. Don't hang yourself, and you'll regret that too. Whether you hang yourself or don't hang yourself, you will regret both. This, gentlemen, is the essence of all philosophy. The mention of laughter is not a coincidence. Key to Kierkegaard's philosophy is that the only intelligent, tactical response to life's horror is to laugh defiantly at it. Rarely is a philosopher taken humor as seriously. Kierkegaard is often described as the founder of the philosophical movement known as Existentialism, because in him we find all the themes that would so interest later thinkers like Sartre, Camus, and Heidegger. The book that fascinated the existentialists was Kierkegaard's The Concept of Anxiety, published in 1844, in which he emphasized a new word, angst, or angst as we know it in English, a condition where we understand how many choices we face and how little understanding we can ever have of how to exercise these choices wisely. As Kierkegaard wrote, life can only be understood backwards, but must be lived forwards. Our constant angst means that unhappiness is more or less written into the script of life. As he wrote, anyone who has given the matter any serious thought will know that I'm right when I say it's not possible for anyone to be absolutely and in every conceivable way completely content, not even for a single half hour of his life. No one has come into the world without crying. No one asks when you want to enter the world. No one asks when you want to leave. How empty and meaningless life is. We bury a person, throw 3 shovels of earth over him, drive out in a coach, drive back in a coach, and console ourselves that we still have life enough left to live. But really, how long is 70? Why not just get it over with straight away? For Kierkegaard, there was, however, one answer that he put forward ever more stridently in his later works: Jesus Christ. Kierkegaard loathed the Christianity of the established Danish church, but he adored the simple truths of the Gospels that his father had taught him as a boy. For him, Christianity was a religion of extreme surrender to a theology of almost peasant-like simplicity. One was to be ready to die for Christ, to give up all attachment to worldly things, and to love all humans like one's siblings. Kierkegaard wasn't interested in justifying his attachment to Christianity through rational means. Instead, he recommended a dramatic and now famous leap of faith, wherein one wouldn't apply one's puny mind to attempting to prove the existence of God. One would merely switch off one's faulty rational faculties and jump into the idea of God as the total solution. As he put it, to have faith is to lose your mind and to win God. Like Marxist communism, Kierkegaard's solutions to the problems of being human are far less convincing and interesting than the diagnoses of our ills. Few of us now make that leap. But Kierkegaard deserves our attention for the beautifully bitter, caustic look he cast on the human condition. He's one of the few philosophers one can turn to when the world has badly let us down, and we're in need of a friend who can fully understand the dark places we're in once the sentimental illusions that normally keep us going fall away.
Okay, so there's a couple of very important things going on there that we just need to highlight. The first thing is, this is a philosopher who, when he looks at society, when he looks at civilization, he finds it ridiculous. He finds it utterly ridiculous. The institutions of the family, the idea that I will be happy, I will be fulfilled by just having a regular family, by getting myself a career, by engaging in a marriage that unites romance with prudence or stability. These are the things that when he looks at society, he finds them ridiculous. What he sees is a bunch of people who are not in touch with what it is to truly live a full, fulfilling life, and they're living so far below the threshold, and they're not aware of it. They are underappreciating life, and they're living life at like 10%. And they're carrying themselves as if they're fulfilled, as if this is what living really is. But he finds this ridiculous. To get a career, I mean, the meaning of life is to get a career, to start a family, to go to church and engage in mechanical rituals that have no passion. That's what he finds ridiculous, right? To succeed, to be a success in society is a whole bunch of mindless mechanical conformity. And he finds that ridiculous. So as a writer, his first priority is to raise everyone's consciousness, to make them woke, and to see just how ridiculous their illusions are. And their illusions are coming from politics and economics. Because as we gain more technology and control over our society and our environment, we start to buy into the illusion that we don't need religion, we don't need to depend on anything above ourselves, we're in control. So you start thinking that if you just elect the right politician, and if you just, manipulate the economy the right way and work hard, that's a fulfilled life. But Kierkegaard disagrees with that. Kierkegaard finds it ridiculous. And in fact, he's out to remind us just how bad and disappointing life truly is. In between that big story that we tell ourselves about our great economies and our great politics, in between, there's this other thing going on called life. And it's very sad. People are dying constantly. There's disease. You see my point? There's breakups. There's war. And yet we're sugarcoating it as if all we need is peace and stability and economic growth and the election of the right administration, and that is living a meaningful life. He's like, no. And in this respect, he's very much like Pascal. Pascal was the exact same. The transition that Pascal made, guys, is very interesting compared to Kierkegaard. Pascal was a genius, mathematical genius, physicist, philosopher, just a brilliant, brilliant guy. But as he grew older, he started to feel empty. He started to feel that all this advanced science and all this genius, all this reason was empty. And he began to go closer and closer towards religion until finally he gave up the philosophy and the mathematics. And he just gave himself over completely to Christianity. And he wrote some of the most beautiful French prose writing that has ever been written. And Kierkegaard is going through a similar transition. Kierkegaard was raised very Christian, but then he deviated and he became like, kind of like someone who just loves fun, and he tried to just live this sensual lifestyle, a hedonist basically. But he quickly found that that's not sustainable. And that's the story of Kierkegaard, and that's why he's considered the founder of existentialism, because existentialism has two parts. One is what is the meaning and value of life? But the only way you can reach that point is to answer this other question. What is it to truly be human? Like genuinely, authentically human? And so Kierkegaard begins to see there are levels. If you live like an animal, that's one aspect of being human. We do have an animal aspect. But if you just gratify every appetite like a brute, like an animal, you will fall into despair. It's not sustainable. Your soul will begin to want more. You will commit suicide if all you do is become a hedonist, stimulating every single sense. You will get so desperate that you'll start introducing a rotation. You'll start saying, okay, I had one meal on Monday, I had lasagna on Tuesday, pizza on Wednesday, let me switch it up. I'll have Chinese food on Friday. And then for lunch, I'll have some potato chips. You see what I'm saying? You'll start to try and stimulate yourself desperately to fight off boredom and to have variety. That kind of life is not sustainable. He experimented with it himself and he fell into despair. So that's the bottom level. That's called the aesthetic level of being human. If you try to live just at the aesthetic level, the level of the senses and pleasure and refinement, sipping wine from 1856, and then the next day sipping wine from 1922, is that what your life becomes? If that's what you consider refinement, you will commit suicide. So naturally, you will be drawn to evolve, and you'll have to make a decision. Will I stay at this pathetic level that I'm at, or will I commit to something higher that increases my sense of being human, takes me to a deeper level of being human, and satisfies me more, fulfills me, and makes life more worthy of living? That next level is called the ethical level. The ethical level, you say, okay, life is not some big joke where I go around stimulating myself as much as possible. There's a real world out there, and there's a life to be lived. I can honor a woman, I can marry her and honor her and treat her well, have responsibilities for her. We can honor each other before God and society. We can raise good children. I can get a job and work hard and have a career. Guys, this is much more meaningful. It sounds boring, but psychologically, if you actually analyze people who take up responsibilities, they are more fulfilled. The pleasures are still there of the aesthetic level, but they're just reincarnated, hosting nice events at family gatherings, treating your coworkers well, being a good citizen, duty, assuming your duties. There is satisfaction there, and you will feel more human. But guys, if it's just ethics, even that level will reach a point at which you will begin to feel inadequate because you will begin to see something even deeper. And that's where Kierkegaard's Christianity comes in. He's going to say, remember we talked about this, from a Christian point of view, you cannot earn salvation. So at the ethical level, you can perform all your duties as best you want, but you'll begin to become conscious of the fact that the law you cannot obey the law. You cannot perfect it on your own strength. You need the strength of God on your side. But that's no longer ethics. That's now religion. That's what a philosopher like Augustine would say. You can't earn salvation, you need God's grace. So that means you need a direct relationship with God. And that's what you saw towards the end of this clip, right? Because he said what? You take a leap of faith. You go beyond ethics. And also ethics has the problem that it's philosophical in the sense that it's rational. You figure out what your duties are and you're using reason to understand right and wrong. But guys, at least in the Christian context, God is beyond reason. God is so spontaneous, he has no limits. Even reason can't contain him. Just take Abraham. Abraham is chilling, and God says, I want you to move from here to there. Spontaneous. Once again, Abraham is old, and God says, you will have a son. Abraham's like, okay. And then he gets a son. And then again, I want you to sacrifice the son that I just gave you. And on and on and on. The Bible is full of spontaneity. You cannot put limits on God. One way to define God is just to say that he's unlimited. He's absolute infinity, but in spontaneity, right? So God can use whoever he wants. He's going to surprise you in who he uses. He's going to surprise you in how he uses you. Complete and utter abandonment of your expectations and putting limits on how things are going to work out. That's the Christian walk with God. No limits. But for that, you have to abandon reason. So here's the beautiful thing, guys. What Kierkegaard is saying is that, yes, life is absolutely worth living if you reach the religious stage. If you become a true Christian, you've got to abandon this distraction called reason and philosophy. Abandon it. Surrender yourself fully to Christ, and you will be catapulted into such a deep level of passion that that passion, that energy which you love God with and which you surrender to God with, that by itself will make life worth living. Because faith is a passion. And for Kierkegaard, faith is even deeper than love, because love is more romantic, but faith is the ultimate passion because you are being passionate about God, which is even deeper than a romantic kind of passion, okay? So that's why Kierkegaard is called the father of existentialism. Now we're going to look at another person we've mentioned a little bit and see the difference.
The challenge begins with how to pronounce his name. The first bit should sound like ni, the second like cha, Nietzsche. Then we need to get past some of his extraordinary and provocative statements. What doesn't kill me makes me stronger. God is dead, and we have killed him. And his large moustache. But when we do, we'll discover a thinker who's intermittently enchanting, wise, and very helpful. Friedrich Nietzsche was born in 1844 in a quiet village in the eastern part of Germany, where his father was the priest. He did exceptionally well at school and university, and so excelled at ancient Greek that he was made a professor at the University of Basel when still only in his mid-20s. But his official career didn't work out. He got fed up with his fellow academics, gave up his job, and moved to Sils Maria in the Swiss Alps, where he lived quietly, working on his masterpieces, among them The Birth of Tragedy, Human All Too Human, The Gay Science, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil, On the Genealogy of Morals. He had lots of problems. He didn't get on with his family. I don't like my mother, and it's painful even for me to hear my sister's voice. Women kept rejecting him. His books didn't sell. And when he was only 44, he had a mental breakdown, precipitated when he saw a horse in a Turin street being beaten by its driver, and ran over to embrace him, shouting, "I understand you." He never recovered and died 11 sad years later. But his philosophy was full of heroism and grandeur. He was a prophet of what he called Selbstüberwindung, or self-overcoming, the process by which a great-souled person, what he called an Übermensch, rises above their circumstances and difficulties to embrace whatever life throws at them. He wanted his work to teach us, as he put it, how to become who we really are. His thought centers around 4 main recommendations. 1. Own up to envy. Envy is, Nietzsche recognized, a big part of life. Yet the lingering effects of Christianity generally teach us to feel ashamed of our envious feelings.
They seem an indication of evil, so we hide them from ourselves and others. Yet there's nothing wrong with envy, maintained Nietzsche, so long as we use it as a guide to what we really want. Every person who makes us envious should be seen as an indication of what we could one day become. The envy-inducing writer, tycoon, or chef is hinting at who you are capable of one day being. It's not that Nietzsche believed we always end up getting what we want. His own life had taught him this well enough. He simply insisted that we must face up to our true desires, put up a heroic fight to honor them, and only then mourn failure with solemn dignity. That is what it means to be an Übermensch. 2. Don't be a Christian. Nietzsche had some extreme things to say about Christianity. In the entire New Testament, he wrote, there is only one person worth respecting, Pilate, the Roman governor. It was knockabout stuff, but his true target was more subtle and more interesting. He resented Christianity for protecting people from their envy. Christianity had, in Nietzsche's account, emerged in the late Roman Empire, in the minds of timid slaves who'd lacked the stomach to get hold of what they really wanted, and so had clung to a philosophy that made a virtue of their cowardice. He called this Sklavenmoral. Christians, whom he rather rudely termed die Herde, the herd, had wished to enjoy the real ingredients of fulfillment, a position in the world, sex, intellectual mastery, creativity, but they'd been too inept to get them. They therefore fashioned a hypocritical creed, denouncing what they wanted but were too weak to fight for, while praising what they didn't want but happened to have. So, in the Christian value system, sexlessness turned into purity, weakness became goodness, submission to people one hates became obedience, and, in Nietzsche's phrase, not being able to take revenge turned into forgiveness. Christianity amounted to a giant machine for bitter denial. 3. Never drink alcohol. Nietzsche himself drank only water, and as a special treat, milk, and he thought we should do likewise. He wasn't making a small, eccentric dietary point. The idea went to the heart of his philosophy, as contained in his declaration, there have been two great narcotics in European civilization, Christianity and alcohol. He hated alcohol for the very same reasons that he scorned Christianity, because both numb pain, both reassure us that things are just fine as they are, sapping us of the will to change our lives for the better. A few drinks usher in a transient feeling of satisfaction that can get fatally in the way of taking the steps necessary to improve our lives. Nietzsche was obsessed with the awkward truth that getting really valuable things done hurts. How little you know of human happiness, you comfortable people, he wrote. The secret of a fulfilled life is live dangerously, build your cities on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. 4. God is dead. Nietzsche's dramatic assertion that God is dead is not, as it's often taken to be, some kind of a celebratory statement. Despite his reservations about Christianity, Nietzsche didn't think that the end of belief was anything to cheer about. Religious beliefs were false, he knew, but he observed that they were very, very beneficial in the sense of helping us cope with the problems of life. Nietzsche felt that the gap left by religion should ideally be filled by culture. He meant philosophy, art, music, literature. Culture should replace scripture. However, Nietzsche was deeply suspicious of the way his own era was handling culture. He believed the universities were killing the humanities, turning them into dry academic exercises, rather than using them for what they were always meant to be, guides to life. He admired the way the Greeks had used tragic drama in a practical, therapeutic way, as an occasion for catharsis and moral education, and wished his own age to be comparably ambitious. He called for a reformation in which people, newly conscious of the crisis brought on by the end of faith, would fill the gaps created by the disappearance of religion with philosophy and art. Every era faces particular psychological challenges, thought Nietzsche, and it's the task of the philosopher to identify and help solve these. For Nietzsche, the 19th century was reeling under the impact of two developments, mass democracy and atheism. The first threatened to unleash torrents of undigested envy, the second to leave humans without guidance or morality. In relation to both challenges, Nietzsche remains our endearing, fascinating, often lovable, and mustachioed guide.
All right, so this is now a very different understanding of what it means to live a meaningful life. For Kierkegaard, in order to, yes, you can live a very meaningful life. You can live a fulfilled life, but by abandoning reason, philosophy, civilization, enter into a direct completely humble relationship with Christ, and your life will be meaningful. Nietzsche is approaching it very differently. Remember, I shared with you Nietzsche compared the other elements of our Western history, the Greco-Roman with the Judeo-Christian. And the Greco-Roman basically, as I shared with you, was aristocratic. An aristocrat is someone who, by birth, is born into privilege, is born into status in society. But as I mentioned to you, one of the things Nietzsche notes, and one of the things that makes him a very interesting person in the history of philosophy, he doesn't believe in absolute ethics. He believes that whatever ethics you see, you need to ask what kind of psychology produced that ethics, and what sort of position in society led people to that psychology. So if you're an aristocrat, you're going to have a very different psychology than someone who is a slave, and that different psychology is going to produce a different ethics. So what we call ethics, what we call the study of right and wrong and good and evil, that is going to be very different for an aristocrat or for an aristocratic class compared to the Judeo-Christian slave class. I mean, it's just a fact of history that for most of the history of the Jews who give us the Bible, for most of that history, they were oppressed, they were slaves. Whether you take in Egypt, whether you take, when they were defeated by the Greeks in the Hellenistic period, the Maccabees, whether you take once again during the period of Jesus, they are being suppressed by the Roman Empire. And even after the Roman Empire collapses in Europe, they have low status. So if status says something about your psychology, and that in turn says something about your ethics, well, when Nietzsche looks at the modern world and he compares the Greco-Roman to the Judeo-Christian, clearly there's been a winner. The Judeo-Christian have won. But how did it win? Well, that's where the story about envy begins to come in, right? It won by convincing people that they're fine just the way they are, and they have nothing to envy for of the aristocrats, right? What does that mean, guys? Well, remember, what is the Sermon on the Mount? Blessed are the meek, blessed are the mild. So if you convince yourself that exactly the way you are, you don't need to improve anything because your weakness is a strength, your sexlessness or your inability to get sex is purity, your submission to authorities that you can't defeat, well, you're going to call that obedience. And then your inability to have revenge, what are you going to call that? Forgiveness. You see the lying is basically, it's psychological lies. You're compensating. You can't take action, so you begin to tell yourself stories and revalue values. You take the values of the aristocrat and you negate them, and then you say, no, I'm good. Why? Because I'm weak. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are the mild. Blessed are those who never hurt others. Blessed are those who forgive. That kind of lying is what he detects in our culture, and it spreads, pervasive. So for him, why is this a problem, guys? Well, the bottom line is this: he's a psychologist, right? And he's looking at specimens of the kinds of lives and the kinds of people who lived lives that were truly worth living. His story is very different from Kierkegaard. For him, the people who live the kind of lives that are most worth living are not the comfortable ones who avoid envy. Think about the Olympic Games. It's full of envy. It's competition. Right? Do you see the point? Who invented the Olympic Games? What people? The Greeks, right? They're completely envious of each other. Not always in a negative way, but they're like, no, I want to win. And they're constantly competing. And that ethic of competition, sportsmanship, even the dramas we have from the Greeks are once again very competitive. Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, they didn't write casually, they wanted to win. And in fact, they are the ones we remember because they did win. That spirit of competition produced excellence. So again, avoiding envy and convincing yourself that things are okay just the way they are, for Nietzsche, that is now a declining culture. If you have a culture like that, where you're outlawing envy, outlawing competition, and convincing yourself everything is good, then the Christianity is playing the same role as alcohol. Instead of going out there and facing your flaws and improving yourself, you'll just have a couple of beers and take it easy and numb your pain, numb your anxieties, numb your anger. Do you see the point? Now, the final nail in the coffin is, so with someone like Nietzsche, you have to live dangerously. Live dangerously. That's the key to living a fulfilled life. Live on the edge. Don't be comfortable. Don't think everything is going to work out through God's grace. Don't think everything is fine. Don't think God's got your back. No. You have to live completely dangerously, because only if you live dangerously will your full vitality show itself. And for him, vitality is what makes life worth living. You need to feel your animal energy surging, whether it's in work, whether it's in passionate academics, whether it's in romances, adventures, whatever it is, you need to be pouring your soul into it. So you've got something analogous with Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are very similar in many ways, but their point of departure is this. Both of them laugh at civilization for different reasons. Kierkegaard laughs at civilization because it's like, these people are deluded. Is this what living is? To marry some girl because she has a good job, live in the suburbs, have 2.5 kids. Is this living? So Kierkegaard laughs at civilization, and Nietzsche laughs at it too. Oh, this is what it is to live. I have to be a Christian, right? So to say everything is fine, God's got my back, I live by grace, and you take no risk. Both of them are laughing at civilization, but for different reasons. Kierkegaard says, wake up. Politics will not save you. Economics will not save you. You need to have a passion. Your soul needs to be on fire for God, and that will make your life worth living. Nietzsche says, yes, your soul needs to be on fire. You need to feel vitality. You need to feel your blood flowing through your veins. But because God is dead, because our culture has evolved to the point where we can no longer realistically believe in God the same way we did before science and the scientific revolution and things, he accepts that we have to assert our wills and we have to make ourselves the best we can be. And that's what will replace God. The Superman or the Ubermensch, we need to be working on producing the best version of humanity possible. And that's what will substitute the death of God. God is no longer the object of faith. Vitality, the feeling of power in anything you do, feeling your own power at its optimum level, that will make life worth living. Okay? So, yeah. Now we'll move on to the 20th century. Both of those were 19th century. So, very interesting thinker coming up.
If you manage a team, you have to try Monday.com. Monday.com is a platform to track everything your team is working on. We use it for all.
Martin Heidegger is without doubt the most incomprehensible German philosopher that ever lived. Nothing quite rivals the prose in his masterpiece Being and Time, which is filled with complex compound German words like Seinsvergessenheit, Bodenständigkeit, and Wesensverfassung. Yet beneath the jargon, Heidegger tells us some simple, even at times homespun truths about the meaning of our lives, the sicknesses of our time, and the routes to freedom. We should bother with him. He was born and in many ways remained a rural provincial German who loved picking mushrooms, walking in the countryside, and going to bed early. He hated television, aeroplanes, pop music, and processed food. At one time, he'd been a supporter of Hitler, but saw the error of his ways. Much of his life, he spent in a hut in the woods, away from modern civilization. He diagnosed modern humanity as suffering from a number of diseases of the soul. Firstly, we have forgotten to notice we're alive. We know it in theory, of course, but we aren't day to day properly in touch with the sheer mystery of existence, the mystery of what Heidegger called das Sein, or in English, being. It's only at a few odd moments, perhaps late at night, or when we're ill and have been alone all day, or are on a walk through the countryside, that we come up against the uncanny strangeness of everything, why things exist as they do, why we're here rather than there, why the world is like it is. What we're running away from is a confrontation with the opposite of being, what Heidegger called das Nichts, the nothing. The second problem is we've forgotten that all being is connected. Most of the time, our jobs and daily routines make us egoistic and focused. We treat others and nature as means and not as ends. But occasionally, and again, walks in the country are particularly conducive to this realization. We may step outside our narrow orbit and take a more expansive view. We may sense what Heidegger termed the unity of being, noticing, for example, that we and that ladybird on the bark and that rock and that cloud over there are all in existence right now and are fundamentally united by the basic fact of our common being. Heidegger values these moments immensely and wants us to use them as the springboard to a deeper form of generosity, an overcoming of alienation and egoism, and a more profound appreciation of the brief time that remains to us before das Nichts claims us in turn. The third problem is we forget to be free and to live for ourselves. Much about us isn't, of course, very free. We are, in Heidegger's unusual formulation, thrown into the world at the start of our lives, thrown into a particular and narrow social milieu, surrounded by rigid attitudes, archaic prejudices, and practical necessities not of our own making. The philosopher wants to help us to overcome this thrownness, Geworfenheit, as he put it in German, by understanding it. We need to grasp our psychological, social, and professional provincialism and then rise above it to a more universal perspective. In so doing, we'll make the classic Heideggerian journey away from Uneigentlichkeit to Eigentlichkeit, from inauthenticity to authenticity. We will, in essence, start to live for ourselves. And yet, most of the time, for Heidegger, we fail dismally at this task. We merely surrender to a socialized, superficial mode of being he called they-self, as opposed to ourselves. We follow the chatter, das Gerede in German, which we hear about in the newspapers, on TV, and in the large cities that Heidegger hated to spend time in. What will help us to pull away from the they-self is an appropriately intense focus on our own upcoming death. It's only when we realize that other people cannot save us from das Nichts that we're likely to stop living for them, to stop worrying so much about what others think, and to cease giving up the lion's share of our lives and energies to impress people who never really liked us in the first place. When, in a lecture in 1961, Heidegger was asked how we should better lead our lives, he replied tersely that we should simply aim to spend more time in graveyards. It would be lying to say that Heidegger's meaning and moral is ever very clear. Nevertheless, what he tells us is intermittently fascinating, wise, and surprisingly useful. Despite the extraordinary words and language, in a sense we know a lot of it already. We merely need reminding and emboldening to take it seriously, which the odd prose style may help us to do. We know in our hearts that it's time to overcome our Geworfenheit, that we should become more conscious of das Nichts day to day, and that we owe it to ourselves to escape the clutches of das Gerede for the sake of Eigentlichkeit, with a little help from that graveyard.
All right, guys, all of those philosophers we've covered so far have influenced me greatly. But when I read Heidegger, it completely shook me. Like, if you understand what he's saying, I'm going to try and break it down in a nutshell. It's about 30 minutes. The bottom line, guys, is I'm going to introduce it this way. If you think about yourself, we've talked a little bit about this thing called person, what it makes a person. What is a person? Guys, I want you to focus. Think about this just for a second. How many elements or dimensions of your personality did you choose? And how many of them were you just thrown into? Remember we talked about thrownness? Talked about thrownness, right? This is deep, 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 deep. as an existentialist, he's interested in the same things that Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are. He's trying to find the conditions under which you can live a fulfilling, meaningful life. But in order to do that, the thing that's living, the thing that's got the life, is this weird thing called the human being, the person. So he has to start there and like, okay, wait a minute. What is this thing called a person? And one of the most remarkable observations he makes is that, holy crap, this thing called a person has a feature of it called thrownness. There's so many things that are so important to your personhood and your personality that you never chose. And that's going to be a key to the kind of dynamic that conditions the possibility of your living a fulfilled life. Here's how the story goes. Male, female, right? We do have surgeries now that are kind of advanced, but for the most part, people don't choose their gender. People don't choose to be masculine or feminine. Same kind of thing with race, right? Same kind of thing with your first language. You might learn your second language on your own, but you don't really choose your first language. You don't choose your accent. And then a large part of your personality is a function of things like biology, your personhood, who you are. You never got to choose to be a mammal. You never got to choose to be a human being. You never got to choose to be a vertebrate or to live in this solar system or to live in this galaxy. I hope you see what I'm saying, right? There's so many things about you that you take for granted, but if you really take a step back, they were forced on you. Now, why is this important? Because those elements of who you are were forced on you. What that means is your habits and your way of viewing the world is very narrow and it's stereotyped. You see that? So the short answer is you are not living up to your full potential for two big reasons. One is because you were thrown into a bunch of characteristics and attributes that you never had the power to choose. You never had the power to choose your accent or which neighborhood you were born in or nationality, race, gender. You see that? That's a whole bunch of stuff that you never had power over. And then on top of that, the second feature that really makes it worse is what he's pointing out, which is this they self. In other words, we live a very social existence to the point where we lose our individuality. In other words, in Heidegger's eyes, when he looks at us, he sees a whole lot of vagueness. He can't see quite who you are because you're such a conformist. And even the things that are good are still conformist. Like what? Education. There's so much conformity. I mean, I just wish I could convey to you the importance of this. You cannot live a fulfilled, meaningful life, according to Heidegger, until you come to terms with just how blurry and vague you are and how much of you never chose. Until you come to terms with that, you cannot live a fulfilled life. Instead, you'll live a very fuzzy, vaguely aware, you'll be dimly aware of your full potential, but you'll never reach that potential unless you make that transition from what he calls inauthenticity to authenticity. In inauthenticity, you do what everybody else does and you conform mindlessly. And you do so partly because psychologically you're afraid of something. You're afraid of something that he calls das Nichts, the nothing. That is, there's certain experiences that you can have during rare moments of your time as a human being where you're reminded that all this stuff around us, whether it's furniture, chairs, buildings, roads, electronics, there's an experience of them, a phenomenological experience of them in a mood called anxiety. Every now and then, you'll get a hint at just how random and arbitrary our way of life is. And why is that important, guys? Once you begin to see just how random and arbitrary it is, there's a new freedom that becomes possible. Why? Because if it's truly random and arbitrary, what does that say? It's not necessary. It seems necessary, but it's not necessary. And if it's not necessary, then what? Then it's possible that it could be quite different in many ways. You see that? That's the beauty of Heidegger. When we live an inauthentic, vague life where we blur into each other, we use the same transportation, we use the same iPhones, we get educated at the same schools, same kind of curriculum, we read the same newspapers, the same social media, we have a hive mind, but that blurs you out. That thing called you is indistinct, it's inauthentic. But during these moments where a certain mood can catch you, you're like, wait a minute, why do I have 5 fingers? Isn't it weird that I have 5 fingers? Why do I have 2 legs? Why do I sit on these things called chairs? They look weird. Why are buildings shaped this way? You know, why do I need oxygen to survive? All of that stuff begins to seem arbitrary. And it wakes you up, you might panic, you're like, oh crap. But what it does, it takes you out of the vagueness. And for once, you begin to see things razor sharp. It's scary. And that's why psychologically, unconsciously, you might want to stay with the vagueness. It's comfortable to be inauthentic. Right? But what Heidegger is saying, you have the courage to hold on to the anxiety, you'll be catapulted into a new way of being human. Now, there's still a lot of stuff you can't change. I mean, you can't walk around naked or whatever. I mean, you'll just be weird. But it'll open up some freedom. You might be like, hey, I don't have to do what everyone else does on a number of issues. I don't have to go to college. Maybe I have ideas of my own. I don't have to live in the same neighborhood I was born. I can travel the world. I don't have to follow everyone else's understanding of romance. I can develop my own. I can have my own love affairs. I can approach love in my own way. And certainly the same is for religion. So that really, in a nutshell, is why Heidegger is considered the greatest philosopher of the 20th century. He woke us up in a way that was just earth-shaking. When I first read Heidegger, it's like I couldn't believe what I was reading. So guys, he is considered, him and Wittgenstein are considered the greatest philosophers of the 20th century. But I think Heidegger, man, he's so original, so fresh, and so relevant. But the German that he uses is torturous. It's like torture to read it. But if you can make it through it in a good translation, it will be worth it. All right, let's move on to his disciple. Heidegger is a German, but his disciple is French. And it's from his disciple that we get the normal understanding of what existentialism is.
You're going to have to get used to asking questions that might make you a little bit uncomfortable.
Jean-Paul Sartre made thinking and philosophy glamorous. He was born in Paris in 1905. His father, a Navy captain, died when he was a baby, and he grew up extremely close to his mother until she remarried, much to his regret, when he was 12. Sartre spent most of his life in Paris, where he often went to cafes on the left bank. He had a strabismus, a wandering eye, and wore distinctive heavy glasses. He was very short, 5 feet 3 inches, and frequently described himself as ugly. By the 1960s, Sartre was a household name in both Europe and the United States, and so was his chosen philosophy, Existentialism. Sartre is famous principally for his book, Being and Nothingness, which enhanced his reputation not so much because people could understand his ideas, but because they couldn't quite. Existentialism was built around a number of key insights. 1. Things are weirder than we think. Sartre is acutely attentive to moments when the world reveals itself as far stranger and more uncanny than we normally admit. Moments when the logic we ascribe to it day to day becomes unavailable, showing things to be highly contingent and even absurd and frightening.
Sartre's first novel, Nausea, published in 1938, is full of evocations of such moments. At one point, the hero, Roquentin, a 30-year-old writer living in a fictional French seaside town, is on a tram. He puts his hand on the seat, but then pulls it back rapidly. Instead of being the most basic and obvious piece of design, scarcely worth a moment's notice, the seat promptly strikes him as deeply strange. The word seat comes loose from its moorings. The object it refers to shines forth in all its primordial oddity, as if he's never seen one before. Roquentin has to force himself to remember that this thing beside him is something for people to sit on. For a terrifying moment, Roquentin has peered into what Sartre calls the absurdity of the world. Such a moment goes to the heart of Sartre's philosophy. To be Sartrean is to be aware of existence as it is when it's been stripped of any of the prejudices and stabilizing assumptions lent to us by our day-to-day routines. We can try out a Sartrean perspective on many aspects of our own lives. Think of what you know as the evening meal.
What do you think I should do, guys? No, I've never seen a remote here. It's interesting. I'll just
Philosophy. To be Sartrean is to be aware of existence as it is when it's been
I don't know why
stripped
it
of
would do
any of the
that.
prejudices.
I just don't know what to press. Turn projector on, right? It's back? Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll rewind it. I really want you to hear about the start. Okay, all right, let's go. We'll go back. Sorry about that.
Nausea, published in 1938, is full of evocations of such moments. At one point, the hero, Roquentin, a 30-year-old writer living in a fictional French seaside town, is on a tram. He puts his hand on the seat, but then pulls it back rapidly. Instead of being the most basic and obvious piece of design, scarcely worth a moment's notice, the seat promptly strikes him as deeply strange. The word seat comes loose from its moorings. The object it refers to shines forth in all its primordial oddity, as if he's never seen one before. Roquentin has to force himself to remember that this thing beside him is something for people to sit on. For a terrifying moment, Roquentin has peered into what Sartre calls the absurdity of the world. Such a moment goes to the heart of Sartre's philosophy. To be Sartrean is to be aware of existence as it is when it's been stripped of any of the prejudices and stabilizing assumptions lent to us by our day-to-day routines. We can try out a Sartrean perspective on many aspects of our own lives. Think of what you know as the evening meal with your partner. Under such a description, it all seems fairly logical, but a Sartrean would strip away the surface normality to show the radical strangeness lurking beneath. Dinner really means that when your part of the planet has spun away from the energy of a distant hydrogen and helium explosion, you slide your knees under strips of a chopped-up tree and put sections of dead animals and plants in your mouth and chew, while next to you, another mammal whose genitals you sometimes touch is doing the same. 2. We are free. Such weird moments are certainly disorienting and rather scary, but Sartre wants to draw our attention to them for one central reason: because of their liberating dimensions. Life is a lot odder than we think, but it's also, as a consequence, far richer in possibilities. Things don't have to be quite the way they are. In the course of fully realizing our freedom, we will come up against what Sartre calls the angoisse, or anguish of existence. Everything is terrifyingly possible because nothing has any preordained, God-given purpose. Humans are just making it up as they go along and are free to cast aside their shackles at any moment. 3. We shouldn't live in bad faith. Sartre gave a term to the phenomenon of living without taking freedom properly on board. He called it bad faith. We are in bad faith whenever we tell ourselves that things have to be a certain way and shut our eyes to other options. It's bad faith to insist that we have to do a particular kind of work or live with a specific person or make our home in a given place. The most famous description of bad faith comes in Being and Nothingness, when Sartre notices a waiter who strikes him as overly devoted to his role, as if he were first and foremost a waiter rather than a free human being. His movement is quick and forward, a little too precise, a little too rapid. He comes towards the patrons with a step that's a little too quick. He bends forward a little too eagerly. His voice, his eyes express an interest a little too solicitous for the order of the customer. The man, he was probably modelled on someone in Saint-Germain's Café de Flore, has convinced himself that he is essentially, necessarily a waiter, rather than a free creature who could be a jazz pianist or a fisherman on a North Sea trawler. 4. We're free to dismantle capitalism. The one factor that most discourages people from experiencing themselves as free is money. Most of us will shut down a range of possible options, moving abroad, trying out a new career, leaving a partner, by saying, that's if I didn't have to worry about money. This passivity in the face of money enraged Sartre at a political level. He thought of capitalism as a giant machine designed to create a sense of necessity, which doesn't in fact exist in reality. It makes us tell ourselves we have to work a certain number of hours, buy a particular product or service, and so on. But in this, there's only the denial of freedom and a refusal to take as seriously as we should the possibility of living in other ways. It was because of these views that Sartre had a lifelong interest in Marxism. Marxism seemed in theory to allow people to explore their freedom by reducing the role played in their lives by material considerations. Sartre took part in many protests in the streets of Paris in the 1960s. Arrested yet again in 1968, the president of France, Charles de Gaulle, had him pardoned, saying, "You don't arrest Voltaire." Sartre also visited Fidel Castro and Che Guevara and admired them both deeply. As a result of these connections and his radical politics, the FBI kept a large file on Sartre, trying to deduce what his suspicious philosophy might actually mean. Sartre is inspiring in his insistence that things don't have to be the way they are. He's hugely alive to our unfulfilled potential as individuals and as a species. He urges us to accept the fluidity of existence and to create new institutions, habits, outlooks, and ideas. The admission that life doesn't have some preordained logic and is not inherently meaningful can be a source of immense relief when we feel oppressed by the weight of tradition and the status quo.
So guys, I think you can see the continuation going on in Sartre of Heidegger, right? Heidegger is saying, look, yes, there is a way to live a very meaningful, deep life, but you've got to escape from your narrow-mindedness that's been imposed on you by nature and by society. And once you become this authentic thing that's you, once you become the truest version of you, a lot of things will remain the same. You'll still have the same body, you'll still have the same necessities in many ways, but you'll be a lot freer. You won't have to conform. And Sartre is taking that to a new level. Sartre is also writing in France after the Second World War. So they've been demoralized. We've seen a lot of conformity in the totalitarianism of the Nazis. So he's trying to wake up his fellow man, his fellow Frenchmen, his fellow Europeans, everybody. And like, we don't have to live as if things have to be this way. That sense of familiarity, like, oh, this is just how things are, and this is how things have to be, that it's necessary, that's what Sartre is rebelling against. He's saying, you don't have some sort of human or personal essence that makes you what you are, and then you start existing based on that. It's the opposite. For Sartre, you just exist. You just thrown, kind of like Heidegger, into the world, but you're thrown into the world, and then there's all this stuff that you can do to shape your identity. And it's in the creativity, it's in the creation of your identity that the meaningfulness of life lives. Remember, things are weirder than they are. We have a sense of familiarity that closes off a lot of the possibilities that exist for us. But if we wake up and we begin to see the strangeness and the beauty of life, then we'll begin to see all the gaps that we can fill using our own creativity, all the alternatives. We'll start telling us, I have to live in Miami for the rest of my life. I have to stay with this girlfriend or this boyfriend. I have to do this or that. And that's why he was afraid of capitalism. Because capitalism is very consumeristic. It says, you've got to live in this kind of neighborhood. You've got to own this kind of phone. It's constantly hitting you with things that you quote unquote need that are necessary. But once you get a sense of that false sense of burden, you can embrace a meaningful freedom. Now, again, this is not to say that you're omnipotent and you can do whatever you want. There are limitations. You can't fly, you know what I mean? You don't have wings. You still have to eat every day, that kind of thing. You can't escape that. But in terms of like creatively shaping your life and doing something that's passionate and interesting to you and something that is not so conformist, that is a real possibility. All right, let me see how much time we have left. Okay, yep, we're gonna finish up with one last thinker, a French Algerian thinker, Camus, and that's it, guys.
Albert Camus was an extremely handsome mid-20th century French-Algerian philosopher and writer whose claim to our attention is based on 3 novels, The Outsider, The Plague, The Fall, and 2 philosophical essays, The Myth of Sisyphus and The Rebel. Camus won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1957 and died at the age of 46, inadvertently killed by his publisher Michel Gallimard when his Facel Vegas sports car they were in crashed into a tree. In his pocket was a train ticket he had decided not to use at the last minute. Camus' fame began with and still largely rests upon his novel of 1942, The Outsider. Set in Camus' native Algiers, it follows the story of a laconic, detached, ironic hero called Meursault, a man who can't see the point of love or work or friendship, and who one day, somewhat by mistake, shoots dead an Arab man without knowing his own motivations, and ends up being put to death, partly because he doesn't show any remorse, but not really caring for his fate one way or the other. The novel captures the state of mind defined by the sociologist Emile Durkheim as anomie, a listless, affectless, alienated condition where one feels entirely cut off from others and can't find a way to share their sympathies or values. Reading The Outsider has long been a well-known adolescent rite of passage among French and many other teenagers, which isn't a way of doing it down, for a lot of the greatest themes are first tackled at 17 or so. The hero of The Outsider, Meursault, cannot accept any of the standard answers for why things are the way they are. He sees hypocrisy and sentimentality everywhere and can't overlook it. He's a man who can't accept the normal explanations given to explain things like the education system, the workplace, relationships, or the mechanisms of government. He stands outside normal bourgeois life, highly critical of its pinched morality and narrow concerns for money and family. As Camus put it in an afterword he wrote for the American edition of the book, Meursault doesn't play the game. He refuses to lie. He says what he is. He refuses to hide his feelings, and so society immediately feels threatened. Much of the unusual, mesmerizing quality of the book comes from the coolly distant voice in which Meursault speaks to us, his readers. The opening is one of the most legendary in 20th century literature and sets the tone. Aujourd'hui, maman est morte, ou peut-être hier, je ne sais pas. The ending is as stark and as defiant. Meursault, condemned to death for a murder committed almost offhand, because it can be interesting to know what it's like to press the trigger, rejects all consolations and heroically accepts the universe's total indifference to humankind. My last wish was that there should be a crowd of spectators at my execution, and that they should greet me with cries of hatred. Even if we're not killers and will ourselves be really quite sad when our mother dies, the mood of The Outsider is one we're all liable to have some experience of, when we have enough freedom to realize we're in a cage, but not quite enough freedom to escape it, when no one seems to understand and everything appears a little hopeless, perhaps in the summer before we go to college. Aside from The Outsider, Camus' fame rests on an essay published the same year as the novel, called The Myth of Sisyphus. This book too has a bold beginning. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living, that is the fundamental question of philosophy. The reason for this stark choice is, in Camus' eyes, because as soon as we start to think seriously, as philosophers do, we will see that life has no meaning, and therefore we will be compelled to wonder whether or not we should just be done with it all. To make sense of this rather extreme claim and thesis, we have to situate Camus in the history of thought. His dramatic announcement that we have to consider killing ourselves because life might be meaningless is premised on a previous notion that life could actually be rich in God-given meaning, a concept which will sound remote to many of us today. and yet we have to bear in mind that for the last 2,000 years in the West, a sense that life was meaningful was a given, accorded by one institution above any other, the Christian Church. Camus stands in a long line of thinkers from Kierkegaard to Nietzsche to Heidegger and Sartre who wrestle with a chilling realization that there is in fact no preordained meaning in life. We're just biological matter spinning senselessly on a tiny rock in a corner of an indifferent universe. We were not put here by a benevolent deity and asked to work towards salvation in the shape of the Ten Commandments. There's no roadmap and no bigger point. And it's this realization that lies at the heart of so many of the crises reported by the thinkers we now know as the existentialists. A child of despairing modernity, Albert Camus accepts that all our lives are absurd in the grander scheme, but, unlike some philosophers, he ends up resisting utter hopelessness or nihilism. He argues that we have to live with the knowledge that our efforts will be largely futile, our lives soon forgotten, and our species irredeemably corrupt and violent, and yet we should endure nevertheless. We are like Sisyphus, the Greek figure ordained by the gods to roll a boulder up a mountain and to watch it fall back down again in perpetuity. But ultimately, Camus suggests we should cope as well as we can at whatever we have to do. We have to acknowledge the absurd background to existence and then triumph over the constant possibility of hopelessness. In his famous formulation, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. This brings us to the most charming and seductive side of Camus, the Camus who wants to remind himself and us of the reasons why life can be worth enduring, and who in the process writes with exceptional intensity and wisdom about relationships, nature, the summer, food and friendship. As a guide to the reasons to live, Camus is delightful. Many philosophers have been ugly and cut off from their bodies. Think of sickly Pascal, crippled Leopardi, sexually unsuccessful Schopenhauer, or poor peculiar Nietzsche. Camus was by contrast very good looking, extremely successful with women for the last 10 years of his life. He never had fewer than 3 girlfriends on the go and wives as well. And he had a great dress sense, influenced by James Dean and Humphrey Bogart. It isn't surprising that he was asked to pose by American Vogue. These weren't all just stylistic works. Once you properly realize that life is absurd, you're on the verge of despair perhaps, but also compelled to live life more intensely. Accordingly, Camus grew committed to and deeply serious about the pleasures of ordinary life. He said he saw his philosophy as a lucid invitation to live and to create in the very midst of the desert. He was a great champion of the ordinary, which generally has a hard time finding champions in philosophy. And after pages and pages of his denser philosophy, one turns with relief to moments when Camus writes with simplicity in praise of sunshine, kissing, or dancing. He was an outstanding athlete as a young man. Once asked by his friend Charles Poncet which he preferred, football or the theatre, Camus is said to have replied, "Football without hesitation." Camus played as goalkeeper for the junior local Algiers team, Racing Universitaire d'Alger, which won both the North African Champions Cup and the North African Cup in the 1930s. The sense of team spirit, fraternity, and common purpose appealed to Camus enormously. When he was asked in the 1950s by a sports magazine for a few words regarding his time with football, he said, "After many years during which I saw many things, what I know most surely about morality and the duty of man, I owe to sport." Camus was also a great advocate of the sun. His beautiful essay Summer in Algiers celebrates the warmth of the water and the brown bodies of women. He writes, "For the first time in 2,000 years, the body has appeared naked on beaches. For 20 centuries, men have striven to give decency to Greek insolence and naivety, to diminish the flesh and complicate dress. But today, young men running on Mediterranean beaches repeat the gestures of the athletes of Delos." He spoke up for a new paganism based on the immediate pleasures of the body. This extract from Summer in Algiers. "I recall a magnificent tall girl who danced all afternoon. She was wearing a jasmine garland on her tight blue dress, wet with perspiration from the small of her back to her legs. She was laughing as she danced and throwing back her head. As she passed the tables, she left behind her a mingled scent of flowers and flesh." Camus railed against those who would dismiss such things as trivial and longed for something higher, better, purer. If there is a sin against this life, he wrote, it consists perhaps not so much in despairing of life as in hoping for another life and in eluding the quiet grandeur of this one. In a letter he remarked, "People attract me insofar as they're impassioned about life and avid for happiness. There are causes worth dying for, but none worth killing for." Camus achieved huge acclaim in his lifetime, but the Parisian intellectual community was deeply suspicious of him. He never was a Parisian sophisticate. He was a working-class pied noir, that is, someone born in Algeria but of European origin, whose father had died of war wounds when he was an infant and whose mother was a cleaning lady. It isn't a coincidence that Camus' favourite philosopher was Montaigne, another very down-to-earth Frenchman, and someone one can love as much for what he wrote as for what he was like, someone one would have wanted as a wise and life-enhancing friend. This, too, is what philosophy is about.
So you take it full circle, guys. Camus clearly believes that life is worth living. He's a fan of life. He loves sport, he likes the ladies, he loves food, he loves good weather. So he's very charming because on the one hand, he recognizes the absurdity of life. What's the absurdity of life? Well, it's the fact that, like Sartre, he believes we don't have an essence. There's nothing determining us to be any particular thing. We have some restrictions on what we can be, but for the most part, Sartre believed that we're condemned to be free. That is, your identity is always up to you, and you can never relieve yourself of that responsibility. You're condemned to be free. And so you can think of Camus kind of doing something similar. He's saying you're condemned to face the absurdity of the world, and you're also condemned to overcome the despair and the hopelessness that comes with it. So Sisyphus recognizes as he's pushing up the boulder, he's doing something absurd. It's futile. As soon as he pushes it up, it's going to roll back down. And that's kind of like part of what it is to be human. Our routines, we eat every day, we do our grooming, we shower. We do a whole bunch of routines that seem empty and meaningless. And yeah, in the wrong mood, you might feel like committing suicide. But Camus is a fan of life. And he's more on the Greek side rather than the Roman side, than the Jewish side. But he's not like Nietzsche. He doesn't think that vitality in the sense of power is how you justify life and make it meaningful. He's much more the simple pleasures of life, right? Beauty, erotic beauty, festivals, simple happiness, ordinary life. Ordinary life is properly understood aesthetically. Ordinary life has a very rich aesthetic. Every meal you share with somebody, all the music we have. In a day, we have a sunrise and a sunset, beautiful cloud formations. In a city like Miami, we can go to the beach. And then things like sport, those things like sport, where vitality, that Nietzschean vitality comes in. But again, it's not so much about the power like Nietzsche, it's just aesthetic. That sportsmanship and that team spirit, feeling like you're a team player, it makes you feel alive. And so he definitely thinks life is worth living. It's just that sometimes we look far beyond it. We think that we want to go to heaven, that's where we will start living. He's saying, no. This life, the way it is, has a lot of charm. You just have to look at it properly. Art doesn't belong in the museums. Art is everyday, ordinary life. You can find plenty of charms, plenty of art in everyday life, lots of beauty. So all of that beauty is one big reason to live. It's well distributed throughout your life. Any questions? All right, guys, so next class is the last class. It's Wednesday. I am going to share some of my research with you. It's based on existentialism and other things. I'm going to show a PowerPoint. We're going to discuss it, and then it'll be toodles. Okay? I'm not taking attendance. I know you. I know you.
Thank you so
Goodbye,
much.
people. Bye.
Bye.